So Fraser, what are we going to be talking about today?
We're now doing this podcast in a week of real positivity. We've got Biden as president-elect, and we've got a potential coronavirus vaccine. So it's things are changing. What I'm really excited about and really positive about is what this Biden coming in as president in the US actually means for us, not just in the UK, but on a global basis in terms of energy policy.
I know this might sound like a really obvious question, but what's the big deal with Biden? Why is that important?
So I think there's two key things. So firstly, just got to take ourselves back to 2015, where we got the Paris Agreement, where everybody signed up, including the US.
Right.
And then 2016 happens, Trump comes into the White House, and essentially then Trump pulls the US out of the climate change, the Paris Climate Change Agreement.
Okay.
Now, that is incredibly important because what it does, it takes out one of the major emitters of carbon dioxide, but B, one of the key players that can actually drive kind of leadership in doing the right thing. Okay. And so 2016 was a key negative in sort of climate change negotiations or climate, just the sort of actions.
Yeah.
And so now what we're doing is we've got Biden coming into the office saying he will, on his first day, rejoin the Paris Agreement. And at the same time, he's talking about trying to push through $1.7 trillion of investment over 10 years into clean energy. He wants to get the US zero carbon by 2050. And alongside the 1.7 trillion, he's talking about raising private capital to get $5 trillion invested into this zero carbon goal. So we've got this enormous shift in energy policy from fracking and that kind of like the cheap shale to actually we've got to do this, guys, and here's a plan. Not saying it's going to be without its challenges, but it's a really positive shift in the US. And I think the US is critical for everyone else in terms of pulling everybody along in the right direction to achieve this net zero or zero carbon position that we need to be in by 2050 at the latest.
When America pulled out, what's happened with the sort of Paris Agreement? Is it like Trump and the US left the party? Did the party just sort of stop, or has it continued?
The UK government has still stuck with its sort of 2050 vision of zero carbon. A number of other countries have all got sort of very aggressive targets,
Right.
But really, if you look at what's actually happened, not much has happened in terms of government infrastructure or government support. And I'm not talking about necessarily supporting through tariffs or etc. But infrastructure spending, saying we have got to spend this much on our energy infrastructure every year to achieve that. If you take the UK market, for instance, since 2015, it was desolate for 3 years. Okay. Nothing happened in renewables, really. What happened was that actually solar prices, and wind also, but predominantly solar prices, have come down by about 80%, 90% from where they were in, say, 2010. And what that's meant is that actually now private investors are able to sort of invest in solar and wind and make a viable business case for that.
Right.
Okay. But the problem is, it's not enough. It's nowhere near enough to actually achieve what we need to achieve by 2030, 2040, 2050. So what if we just let the quote unquote market continue to develop solar, wind and other renewable technologies, EVs, as another sort of example, they'll do it, but it won't be to the level that is required, I believe, to achieve 2050. So what's really important is we need governments to support significant infrastructure spending in this area, lay out plans, whether it's getting the market to support them in developing those, but we need to say we are going to commit to this. And until we see that, nothing. We're just going to sort of dilly-dally around.
Yeah.
So Biden coming in, changing the US, actually I think there's this drag-along impact, which will start to get people into place. And I think there's one other thing about investment that's really important to say. Maybe I'll be slightly controversial here, but the world has changed so dramatically in the last 6 to 9 months. Okay, we have moved from a world where the mass transportation of people from one place to another place of work has just been thrown on its head.
Sure.
I don't even know whether I'll ever go to London,
Yeah.
for instance, for a meeting again. I mean, I just don't know, because now it has become so normalised to have a video conference call
Totally.
that actually, why get on a train or in a car or whatever?
Yeah, yeah.
So just to put things into perspective, like HS2, we're spending over £100 billion, let's say $150 billion, just to put it in perspective.
Yeah.
The International Space Station, how much did that cost us?
Oh gosh, $400 billion.
It's a good guess, $200 billion.
Okay.
So we're almost spending as much as we've spent on the International Space Station, right, which is a pretty grand project up in space, to basically get people from one place to another, 30 minutes faster, an hour faster.
Sounds crazy.
In a world where... So what we need to be doing is reassessing in with this big shift, is if we're going to spend 100, 200 billion pounds on particular areas of infrastructure, where's the relevant area to spend that, given this change in the worldview that's occurred so rapidly over the last 9 months?
So do you think the current government does actually recognise that?
Well, I think Boris Johnson, as our current Prime Minister, has a real... I think there is an environmentalist within him, and we're seeing that. There's a big fight going on, I think it seems, in the UK at the moment, between number 10 and number 11 about where to spend money. And I think, and both sides probably have some kind of a right. Rishi Sunak's sort of saying, wait, we need to see what happens before we start spending any money. And I think Boris Johnson, from what you can read in the papers, is saying we've got to start spending money on the environmental aspects. Obviously, his father is a big environmentalist, so he's got sort of influences around him. But also, we're hosting in Glasgow COP next year. Big deal. With the US back on board, that is going to be a very, very important event. And I think that they need to start creating this kind of strategy over the next 12, because it's only 12 months away, right?
But it's quite interesting that. So COVID has sort of booted that 12 months down the road, but that's actually allowed a change, probably a change of policy from one of the biggest carbon emitters on the planet. So it's quite handy, isn't it?
Well, actually, I haven't really thought about it like that. But yeah, I mean, maybe these things happen for some kind of a reason. And not that we needed COVID to sort of get climate policy to happen, but the timing.
But maybe we do. Maybe we do though. I mean, that's the whole thing with COVID, isn't it? It's like it's forcing people to behave and think in deep ways. They're changing their behaviour. They're not just sort of thinking about change. They are and have changed.
Well, it's right. I mean, the thing for me that COVID has really brought up is, and I think this is something also really critical for for climate change, is we always talk about carbon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But and I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but we don't talk necessarily about biodiversity.
Right. Okay.
And I think the two go hand in hand, because there is an argument that that COVID is the result of us losing our biodiversity, and therefore things can interact more easily. And I think if I was advising the government or governments, I would bring biodiversity up on a level pegging with carbon dioxide, and I would think about how do you also value biodiversity. How do you, we always talk about carbon dioxide, it's £50 a tonne, £100 a tonne, or whatever it should be. Well, what actually is the value for biodiversity? And how do we actually pay, or at least try and engender biodiversity with some kind of, because we work with numbers, right? We work best with pounds and pence. And so what is that, and how do we support that? Because we can go and solve climate change, but we need to hold biodiversity hand in hand with that at the same time.
The way you put it about HS2, International Space Station, spending money where it needs to be spent, in the context also of recognising that we can solve big problems when we really focus. Like, so COVID is a really good example, and you did that podcast earlier, didn't you, where you were looking at the way that government has listened to science.
Yes.
So what I'm kind of thinking is, if the science is saying we've got a real problem, we've got climate change, we accept this, we've got money, we're a rich economy, we're spending it on HS2, people don't need to move between sort of London and the north as much as they needed to perhaps a year ago or whatever, really did need to. Spend the money on green new power infrastructure. Is that possible? I mean, are people listening to this, or are you and I having a conversation in Totnes?
Yeah.
And it's basically just another one. We could be down the pub having a few beers, putting the world to rights.
Yeah. Well, okay, gosh. So yeah, I do remember the podcast, and what I was essentially saying in that, very briefly, was that imagine if the Prime Minister stood up with his or her scientific advisors, and we said, right, here's the head of the climate change scientist, and here's the sort of chief biodiversity scientist, or whatever it might be, and this is what they're saying, and this is what we need to do. So actually, this is how we need to act. And I really felt like we as a population listened.
Yeah, we did.
And we responded.
Yeah.
And actually what's interesting about the second lockdown is it's been done so quickly. But we haven't had those daily, had that kind of engagement. I think that we do need to step back. We are spending huge amounts of money at the moment to support this economy that actually maybe COVID has exposed is not quite the right economy in certain ways. And we need to also have a conversation, I think a lot of the HS2 thing is about the northern powerhouse, it's about sort of supporting the north, this kind of north-south divide. We need to refocus the kind of investment story into a shared kind of sort of strategic vision of what's right, what's going to benefit us and our children, our children's children, sort of in terms of from a biodiversity perspective, environmental perspective, in terms of economic perspective. All of these things are connected. I think we've always put the environment as a subset of the economy, but actually it's in a way it's the other way around. The economy is a subset of the environment. If we do not have the right environment, the economy cannot function properly. Okay. So we have like an environment first kind of approach, and we need to start rethinking investment from that perspective, where it's supporting the environment drives the economy, which then supports, and both of those support people's lives. The key challenge in going to zero carbon, and we're seeing it already, is if you want to put solar or wind storage, into the electrical network. I'm talking about electricity now. Just from an electrical perspective, you've got an electrical grid that is trying to balance energy flows second by second. And we come from a world where we used to have just, big power stations pumping energy in one direction all the way down the network. And suddenly we're putting little bits of solar, wind, etc., all over the country, let's say, just from a UK perspective. Distributed, that's what we mean by distributed energy. It's distributed into lots of different places, all intermittent in the sense that you don't know when they're necessarily going to generate, so it's quite hard to balance. So the grid essentially has this real challenge, which is it sort of says, well, we need to put constraints upon what you're doing. So if you want to put solar or wind into the network at the moment, very likely, if you're above a certain size, you will be asked to constrain your generation either at certain times of the day, week, month, year, or you'll be given a static export limit where they'll say you cannot send more than this much back to the grid. And that may be zero in some cases. So you've got a government that says we want zero carbon, okay, and we are going to support this kind of infrastructure. And I absolutely 100% support that is what we need to do. But the challenge is then when you get to our electrical network, which is actually operated by generally private but regulated businesses. And they've got physical infrastructure that has physical constraints, physical limitations. And as soon as you start swamping the network with all of this different generation, all these physical issues that have actually been sort of laying dormant to an extent with this kind of previous infrastructure,
Sure.
suddenly like go, whoa, this is an issue. And so what we're seeing is that actually you can't just put a load of generation into the network. You have to then have these interfaces with the network operators.
Okay.
And that is the challenge. And as we put more and more generation into the network, those constraints will become more and more kind of stringent, I suppose, to an extent. And this is where storage is the big thing as well, because that's the thing that's going to try and smooth out some of these issues. So we have seen a huge increase in the number of projects coming to us that are faced with export limits or constraint limits or active network management limits.
Okay.
And clients do not know what to do.
Okay.
They're saying this is completely new. And also especially, so if you think about development of renewables in the UK, a lot of the big development, when you hear about the big players, they're all in front of them. They're all big solar parks, big wind farms, all quote unquote in front of the meter, right? Which means that they're just exporting straight to the grid. They're not interfacing with any demand. Now what's happening is, actually as a result of COVID, the wholesale price in the market that they were trading with has dropped dramatically. Right. It was down at about £35 a megawatt hour from about sort of £50 or £60 a megawatt hour. Basically, a load of solar projects at the beginning of the year just went, we can't do this. Right. We can't compete. We can't make the money. So there's two routes for an investor to take. You can either invest by exporting to the grid and taking that market risk, or you can work behind the meter, which is where you supply to an industrial site or a business site via what's known as a private wire. Okay. So you then connect your renewable generation to that industrial plant. So when they were working in front of the meter, there were very, very few export constraints or constraints to the market, et cetera, et cetera. When you go behind the meter, suddenly there's a whole heap of other policy and regulations that come into play. Right. So a lot of the bigger guys who are moving to behind the meter have been coming to us and saying, we don't know how to solve these problems. Okay. And this is the key thing. When you do behind the meter private wire PPAs, you get a consistent price. You say, right, it's going to be at this price and it will just go up by inflation every year for the next X number of years. Right. But it brings these challenges that we're finding.
Which is what you're solving.
Which is what we're solving. And then once you've got these constraints, you then need to capture the data. Yeah. So we've also got a big sort of analytics side of our business, which is collecting all the data and then presenting that, which is really critical for investors. The thing to take away from this conversation, I think, is that it's really, really positive. We've got this change in the US potential policy. I think that will drive us along. It will hopefully start to engender the right investment discussions around our energy infrastructure. Also, the politicians have to understand that with that there are issues at the physical level. Yeah. Those problems are solvable. We can make this happen.
Podcasting for brands.